Cheryl Gibbs adjusted the snow-white collar of her blouse and once again scrutinized her reflection in the mirror. The impeccable image of a senator's wife required careful attention to every detail. Her light hair was styled elegantly. Her subtle makeup emphasized her natural beauty, and pearl earrings and a sapphire ring, gifts from her husband, complemented her classic suit. Jonathan was already waiting for her downstairs, browsing through the morning newspapers in the spacious living room of their home in a prestigious neighborhood of Portland. A tall, fit man with graying temples and confident brown eyes, he exuded calm and reliability, exactly what voters wanted to see in their future senator. "Good morning, dear," he said, putting down the newspaper and rising to greet his wife. "Today is an important day, a meeting with union representatives. We need to make a good impression." Cheryl smiled, adjusting his tie. "You always make the right impression. The voters love you." Their morning began as usual with a cup of freshly brewed coffee and a discussion of plans for the day. Martha, the housekeeper, glided silently through the kitchen, arranging French toast and fresh fruit on plates. "Mr. Coleman called to remind us about the interview next Tuesday," Cheryl said, looking through her notes in her diary. "And we're expected at a charity event on Friday." Jonathan nodded, sipping his coffee. "Great. By the way, the campaign headquarters sent the latest poll results. We're leading by 7%. In 12 years of marriage, Cheryl had grown accustomed to this rhythm of life. First, the city council, then a seat in the state legislature, and now the Senate campaign. She had always been there for her husband, supporting him and helping him build the image of the perfect family. The day was scheduled down to the minute. After breakfast, they had a meeting with union leaders at the conference center. Cheryl took her usual place in the front row, smiling as she watched Jonathan talk to the workers. He knew how to connect with any audience, whether business people, intellectuals, or ordinary workers. "We must protect the interests of the working class, ensure decent working conditions and fair pay," he said confidently and sincerely. "I know the problems of ordinary people firsthand. My father worked in a factory for 30 years, and I remember how hard it was for us." The story of his humble origins always resonated with voters. Jonathan skillfully used his experience to show that he was one of them, a man who had achieved everything through hard work. After the speech, they were surrounded by journalists. Cheryl stood close to her husband, radiating support and confidence. She answered questions about her family with a warm smile. "We met at a charity auction. I was working as a curator at an art gallery, and Jonathan was just starting his political career." At home, another reception awaited them. Influential campaign sponsors had gathered in their living room. Cheryl made sure the guests' glasses were always full, kept up the small talk, and subtly steered the conversation in the right direction. "Mrs. Gibbs, you are the epitome of a politician's wife," remarked the spouse of one of the sponsors. Cheryl just smiled modestly in response. She knew her role, to be the perfect backdrop for her husband, to support his image as a family man with traditional values. Late in the evening, when the last guest had left, Jonathan hugged his wife. "You were wonderful today. I don't know how I would have managed without you." Cheryl snuggled up to his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne. "We're a team, remember? Together we can handle anything." A cozy silence reigned in their bedroom on the second floor. Cheryl stood by the window, looking at the lights of the city at night. Below, the streetlights flickered on the well-kept streets, and in the distance the skyscrapers of the business center were visible. She and Jonathan had built a good life, a respectable home, successful careers, a strong marriage. Now there was only one last step left, a seat in the Senate. "What are you thinking about?" Jonathan came up behind her and put his arms around her shoulders. "About how our life will change after the election," she turned to her husband. "Washington, a new home, new surroundings." "Everything will be fine," he kissed her on the temple. The main thing is that we're together." As she fell asleep, Cheryl thought about tomorrow. More meetings, receptions, interviews. She had to keep up appearances, live up to the image of the perfect couple. She would manage. She always had. After all, being a politician's wife was also a kind of art, and Cheryl was an expert in art. Jonathan's office smelled of leather and expensive tobacco. Cheryl rarely came in here. Her husband preferred to work alone, and she respected his personal space. But today, she urgently needed some documents for the house. The tax office had requested copies, and Jonathan was busy with important negotiations. The massive oak desk, leather armchair, and floor-to-ceiling bookcases all exuded solidity and respectability. Cheryl pulled out the top drawer of the desk. Neat stacks of papers, folders with documents. Her husband had always been known for his meticulousness. As she was sorting through the papers, she accidentally knocked over a folder, and its contents spilled onto the floor. Cheryl knelt down to gather the documents, and suddenly her attention was drawn to an old photograph that had slipped out of an envelope. In the yellowed photograph, a young Jonathan, completely different with thick dark hair and no gray, was embracing a beautiful dark-haired girl. They looked happy, in love. The date on the back was 22 years ago. Cheryl frowned. In 12 years of marriage, Jonathan had never mentioned this girl. In fact, he was extremely reluctant to talk about his life before they met, dismissing it with general phrases. There were other photos in the envelope. The same girl in a white dress next to Jonathan in a formal suit, the two of them against the backdrop of the ocean, at some kind of picnic. Wedding photos? Cheryl felt her heart begin to beat faster. Under the photos were documents, an old marriage certificate in the names of Jonathan Gibbs and Elizabeth Frost. Cheryl's hands trembled. A first marriage? Why didn't she know anything about this? Thoughts raced through her head. Maybe it was some kind of mistake. A namesake? But no. The young Jonathan in the photos was undoubtedly her husband. She heard the sound of the door opening downstairs. The housekeeper, Martha, had returned. Cheryl quickly put the documents back in the envelope and returned the folder to its place. Her heart was still pounding like crazy. She couldn't settle down all evening. Jonathan came home late, tired after meetings and negotiations. At dinner, Cheryl stole glances at her husband, trying to find in his face the features of the young man in the photos. "Something wrong?" Jonathan caught her gaze. "You seem tense today." "Just tired," Cheryl smiled stiffly. "I had a lot to do. Maybe you should take a break? The election campaign is wearing us all out." Cheryl nodded, unable to keep up the casual conversation. Questions swirled in her head. Who was Elizabeth Frost? Why had Jonathan hidden his first marriage? What had happened to that girl? She lay awake late into the night, listening to her husband's steady breathing. 12 years of marriage, and such a secret. What else didn't she know about the man sleeping next to her? The next day, Cheryl canceled all her appointments, citing a migraine. Waiting for her husband to leave, she sneaked into his study again. This time, she searched purposefully for information about Jonathan's past. She found old notebooks and some letters in the drawers. She methodically looked through them, trying to piece together the puzzle. Some pages had been torn out, some notes carefully crossed out. One envelope caught her attention, a postmark from 20 years ago, a return address in Seattle. Inside was a short note. "I did as you asked. No one will know, but you must remember your promise." The handwriting was unfamiliar, feminine. There was no signature. Cheryl reread the note several times, trying to grasp its hidden meaning. What promise was she talking about? In another folder were clippings from old newspapers, notes about a young, promising politician named Jonathan Gibbs, his first steps in politics, his participation in local elections. Not a word about his wife. The day flew by. Cheryl was so immersed in her investigation that she missed a call from the campaign manager. She only realized when Martha rang the doorbell to warn her that Mr. Gibbs would be back soon. That evening, sitting next to her husband in their favorite restaurant, Cheryl tried to act normal. Jonathan talked about his meetings with voters and shared his plans for the future. "You know, I've been thinking about the past," Cheryl began cautiously, "about how we met. You didn't tell me much about yourself back then." Jonathan froze for a moment, his glass suspended above his mouth. "The past is the past, dear. What matters is that we're together now." Cheryl noticed his hand tremble. It was barely noticeable, but she knew her husband too well. Something was wrong. At home, she stood under the shower for a long time, trying to collect her thoughts. For 12 years, she had been a model politician's wife, supporting her husband and believing his every word. And now, Jonathan was already asleep in the bedroom. Cheryl looked at his peaceful face and wondered if she had the right to dig into his past. Maybe some secrets were better left untold? But the seed of doubt had already been planted in her mind. She knew that now she couldn't stop until she found out the whole truth. Cheryl took out her phone and opened the search engine. "Elizabeth Frost, Seattle," she typed with trembling fingers. Her morning run always helped Cheryl clear her head. The cool Portland air, the rustle of leaves under her feet, her steady breathing. It all created the illusion that life was going on as usual. But the last few days had turned her perception of her own marriage upside down. Her internet searches had yielded no results. It was as if Elizabeth Frost had never existed. No social media accounts, no mentions in the press. Just a short note in a university newspaper from 20 years ago. A photo of law school graduates, among them Jonathan and that same dark-haired girl. Cheryl stopped to catch her breath, leaning against the trunk of an old maple tree. Her neighbor, Mrs. Dawson, walked by and waved. The elderly woman had lived on their street longer than anyone else. Maybe she knew something? "Good morning, Mrs. Dawson. Would you like to join me for a cup of coffee?" The old woman was delighted by the invitation. In their neighborhood, people rarely dropped in on each other. Everyone was too busy with their careers and social status. "You know, I was looking through some old albums," Cheryl began casually as she poured the coffee. "It's interesting how our neighborhood has changed over the years." "Oh dear, you should have seen it 20 years ago," Mrs. Dawson perked up. "Back then, it was mostly young families just starting out. I remember when young Mr. Gibbs bought the house on Maple Street." Cheryl froze. "On Maple Street? But Jonathan and I have always lived here on Oak Street." "Oh yes, that was before you, dear. It was a lovely house, smaller than this one, of course. Jonathan was just starting his career on the city council." Cheryl's heart beat faster. "And you? Do you remember his first wife?" Mrs. Dawson frowned, stirring her coffee with a spoon. "It was a strange story. Such a lovely girl, Elizabeth. I remember when they moved in, young and happy, and then she suddenly disappeared. Jonathan said they got divorced, and soon after that he sold the house." "Disappeared? How did that happen?" "No one really knows. There were all kinds of rumors." The old woman lowered her voice. "Some said she was pregnant, but I try not to believe gossip." After Mrs. Dawson left, Cheryl opened her laptop. Maple Street, number 84. She remembered the address. Real estate records confirmed that the house did indeed belong to Jonathan. She drove there that same day. The two-story house with a white fence looked cozy and a little old-fashioned. An elderly woman was sitting on the porch. "Excuse me," Cheryl approached. "Have you lived here long?" "More than 15 years, the woman smiled warmly. "A young couple lived here before us. I remember when they left. They were in such a hurry, they even left some of their furniture behind." "Do you know what happened to that woman? To Elizabeth?" The elderly lady looked at Cheryl intently. "Who are you?" "Just an old acquaintance." "Well, I've heard different things, but I remember clearly that a week before they left I saw her with suitcases. She was crying as she got into a taxi." and a month later, the house was sold. That evening, Cheryl sat in her office, analyzing the information she had gathered. The sudden departure, the hasty sale of the house, the pregnancy. What made Jonathan hide all this? In her desk drawer was a folder with newspaper clippings chronicling her husband's political career. It was then, 20 years ago, that he had received his first serious position on the city council, the beginning of his rise up the political ladder. Cheryl opened her browser and typed in Elizabeth Frost, Seattle lawyer. The results page was full of useless information until her eyes fell on a 15-year-old obituary. Elizabeth Frost, 32, tragically killed in a car accident, survived by her 10-year-old son. A son. Jonathan has a son. There was a knock at the door. It was Martha. "Mrs. Gibbs," Mr. Coleman called. "He reminded you about tomorrow's interview for the magazine." "Right, the interview. Another piece about the senator candidate's perfect family." Cheryl looked at her reflection in the monitor. Her hair was immaculate. She was wearing a business suit and pearl earrings. The image of the perfect politician's wife. That evening, lying in bed, she listened to Jonathan rehearsing tomorrow's speech in his study. His voice sounded confident and convincing. "Family values are the foundation of our society. I have always put my family first." Cheryl closed her eyes. Somewhere in Seattle there was a boy, now a grown man, who had never known his father. For what? For a political career? The next day she sent a request to the Seattle University archives. A few days later, a reply arrived with copies of his student records. In a group photo of graduates, she saw them again, young Jonathan and Elizabeth, future lawyers with bright prospects. What made him abandon his family? Fear of scandal, ambition. In those days, divorce could ruin a political career, and an illegitimate child even more so. Cheryl checked her husband's schedule. The next week was filled with meetings with voters and press conferences. Enough time to drive to Seattle. She needed to see him, Jonathan's son, and find out the truth. The old photograph was still in the desk drawer, a happy couple against the backdrop of the ocean. Cheryl ran her finger over her husband's young face. Who were you, Jonathan Gibbs? The man she had loved for 12 years, or the man who was capable of renouncing his own child for the sake of his career? Jonathan stood at the window of the university library, watching the autumn wind blow fallen leaves across the campus. Through the yellowed pages of time, that day remained in his memory with remarkable clarity. His first year of law school, a lecture on constitutional law. Elizabeth sat across the aisle, taking neat notes in small handwriting. Her dark hair was pulled back into a casual bun, and she wore thin-rimmed glasses. She was unlike the other girls who flirted with him, the future rising star of the law school. There was a sense of inner strength and independence about her. "Mr. Gibbs, what do you think of the case of Roe v. Wade?" The professor's voice brought him back to reality. Jonathan began to answer out of the corner of his eye, noticing Elizabeth listening to him with a slight smile. After the lecture, she caught up with him in the hallway. "Not a bad speech, future politician, but you missed the key argument." That's how their story began, with heated debates in the library, studying for exams together, and long walks along the waterfront. Elizabeth was a brilliant student who dreamed of specializing in human rights. Jonathan saw himself in politics, young, ambitious, confident in his future. They got married in their senior year, in a modest ceremony at the university chapel. Elizabeth's parents did not approve of the marriage, considering him too ambitious and unreliable. Perhaps they were right. A small house on Maple Street became their first family home. Elizabeth got a job at a law firm specializing in civil rights. Jonathan began working as an assistant to a city council member, gradually establishing connections in political circles. The news of the pregnancy took them by surprise. Elizabeth was over the moon, but Jonathan... Jonathan remembered how everything inside him went cold when his wife showed him the test. "This is wonderful," Elizabeth beamed. "We're going to be a real family." He hugged her, trying to hide his anxiety. That evening he was asked to run for city council. His mentor, a seasoned politician of the old school, was blunt. "Voters love family people, but a child is an anchor right now. You need to be free, mobile, completely focused on the campaign." The following months turned into a nightmare. During the day, Jonathan spoke at meetings with voters, and in the evening he returned to his wife, whose belly was becoming more and more noticeable. Elizabeth sensed the changes in her husband, his detachment, but she attributed it all to pre-election stress. And then there was that conversation with his future campaign sponsor. "Listen, kid," the elderly tycoon said, puffing on his cigar, "you're promising, smart, and have the right views. But a child at 23, a human rights activist for a wife, that's not the image a future senator needs." Jonathan sat in his office late into the night staring at the ultrasound photo. The tiny speck was his future son. In the morning, he made his decision. "Elizabeth, we need to talk." His voice sounded cold and detached. "My career is at a crucial stage right now. A child. It's too soon. Maybe we should think about it." He didn't finish his sentence. A slap burned his cheek. His wife's eyes were filled with tears. "Are you out of your mind? It's our child. You have to understand. I have a chance to change the world, to make it a better place. But right now, I need to be free from..." "From what?" "From your family. From love. From responsibility." They shouted at each other until they were hoarse. A week later, Elizabeth disappeared, taking only the bare necessities and leaving for an unknown destination. Jonathan only knew that she had returned to Seattle, to her parents. He sold the house and immersed himself in the election campaign. Every month he sent money to the account specified in a short letter from Elizabeth's lawyer. The condition was simple: complete confidentiality, no contact, no claims to paternity. His son was born in November. He found out about it in a short note. The boy was named Aiden. Jonathan looked at his reflection in the office window, a young, successful politician, a rising star on the city council. Only a shadow appeared in his eyes, which even his perfect smile couldn't hide. The years flew by. Jonathan climbed the career ladder and the money went straight into his account in Seattle. Sometimes he imagined his son growing up, taking his first steps, going to school, maturing. But he pushed these thoughts deep inside, drowning them in work and ambition. The news of Elizabeth's death came as a blow. A car accident, a freak accident. He wanted to go to the funeral, but couldn't bring himself to do it. Too many questions, too much risk to his career. Aiden survived the accident. Jonathan secretly followed his fate through a private detective. The boy lived with his grandparents, studied well, and enrolled in medical school. The money continued to come in, now to pay for his education. And then Cheryl came into his life, beautiful, intelligent, the perfect wife for a politician. A new home, a new life, new dreams. Only sometimes, looking at family photos in glossy magazines, he saw another face, a dark-haired girl with glasses who once believed in him more than he believed in himself. Seattle greeted Cheryl with drizzling rain and a damp wind from the bay. She hailed a taxi at the entrance to Seattle Medical Center, a huge modern building made of glass and concrete. The day before, she had managed to find information about Aiden Frost, a leading cardiac surgeon, Stanford graduate, and author of several scientific papers. The hospital lobby was crowded with patients, nurses, and doctors rushing about their business. Cheryl approached the reception desk, where a pretty girl in a blue uniform was looking through some papers. "Good morning. I need to see Dr. Frost. I'm from a medical journal and would like to interview him about new methods in cardiac surgery." She had thought out her cover story in advance. She had indeed worked as a journalist before devoting herself to her husband's career. She took out her old press card. It had expired years ago, but the girl at the desk only glanced at it. Dr. Frost is in surgery right now, but he has consultations after lunch. You can wait in the lobby on the 7th floor. Cheryl took the elevator and sat down in a chair near a large window. Her heart was beating unevenly. What would she say to this man? How would she explain her interest? And most importantly, did she have the right to intrude on his life? Outside the window, the gray sky gradually brightened. Cheryl watched doctors, nurses, and patients walk down the hallway. I wonder what it's like to save someone's life every day. Aiden had chosen a noble profession, unlike his father who preferred political games. Are you here to see Dr. Frost? The nurse's voice brought her out of her reverie. He's free now. You can go into his office. The sign on the door read, Dr. Aiden Frost, Cardiac Surgery. Cheryl took a deep breath and knocked. Come in. She recognized him immediately. The same dark hair, the same broad shoulders as the young Jonathan in the old photographs. Only his eyes were different, gray, like his mother's. Have a seat, Aiden said, pointing to a chair without looking up from his computer monitor. Are you here for the interview? Yes, Cheryl faltered, studying his face. On the wall behind him hung a medical degree, photos with colleagues and some awards. Aiden looked up and she saw a hint of irritation in his eyes. I'm sorry, but I don't have much time. What exactly are you interested in? Your research in minimally invasive surgery. Cheryl took out her notebook, glad she had prepared for the conversation. I read your latest article. For the next hour, she listened to him talk about new techniques, technologies, and clinical trials. Aiden spoke confidently, with expertise, a true professional passionate about his work. Why did you choose cardiac surgery? Cheryl asked when he paused. Something flashed in his eyes, a shadow of a memory. My mother. She had heart problems, a congenital defect. She died when I was 15, not in the accident that was reported in the newspapers. It was actually a complication after surgery. Cheryl felt a lump rise in her throat. So Elizabeth hadn't died in a car accident. It was a legend designed to hide the truth. Tell me about your family, she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. I grew up with my grandparents, Aiden shrugged. The usual story, single mother, died young. I was raised by my grandparents. I never knew my father. Never? He looked at her intently. Why are you interested in that? Does it have anything to do with medicine? I'm sorry, I'm just trying to get a more complete picture. Aiden leaned back in his chair. You know, when I was a kid, I used to imagine him a lot. I made up stories. Maybe he was a secret agent or a famous traveler or... He stopped himself as if realizing what he was saying. I'm sorry, that's personal. Let's get back to medicine. Cheryl watched him talk about his patients, his surgeries, his plans for the future. A successful doctor, saving lives. I wonder if Jonathan knows what his son has become. Does he follow his successes? Was he secretly proud of him? One last question, she said, getting up. If you could say one thing to your father, what would it be? Aiden paused, looking at his hands, the hands of a surgeon, accustomed to holding other people's lives. You know, before, I would have asked, why? Why did he leave? But now it doesn't matter. I became who I am without him, and maybe that's for the best. The southern outskirts of Seattle were lush with greenery. Jonathan parked the rental car a block away from the house he was looking for, a light blue house with a neat front yard. He came here twice a year, always on weekdays when Aiden was at school. Margaret Frost, Elizabeth's mother, greeted him in the living room. Her gray hair was pulled back into a strict bun and her eyes were cold and hostile. Documents were already lying on the coffee table. Aiden's school reports, medical certificates, receipts for extra lessons. He started tutoring in biology, Margaret said dryly, businesslike. He wants to go to medical school. We need to pay for the prep courses. Jonathan silently wrote a check. This routine was repeated year after year. He provided financial support in exchange for minimal information about his son and a guarantee of silence. Sometimes, when leaving the Frost house, he would linger, looking for a familiar figure. Once he saw a tall teenager walking home from school, backpack slung over his shoulder, dark hair tousled by the wind. He looked so much like Elizabeth. Robert Frost, Elizabeth's father, rarely showed up at these meetings. A former philosophy professor, he despised Jonathan with all his heart. "You can buy our silence," he said once, "but you'll never buy forgiveness." Years passed. Aidan went to medical school and began to succeed. Jonathan was secretly proud of his achievements, although he never showed it. All contact was through lawyers, all meetings strictly confidential. "He's asking about his father," Margaret said one day. "What should we tell him?" "The same as always," Jonathan replied, "that his father is dead." The old woman pursed her lips. Lies can't last forever. But the lies lasted, year after year, meeting after meeting. Jonathan came to Seattle on business trips, brought money, and received brief reports on his son's life. Sometimes he came to the hospital where Aidan worked, just to stand in the lobby and watch from afar as the young doctor hurried down the hallway, talking to patients and confidently giving orders to the nurses. On Margaret's desk were photographs of Aidan at his graduation, in a white coat, holding his medical degree. Jonathan never asked for copies of these pictures, but every time he visited, he would stare at them for a long time. "He turned out to be a good man," Margaret said once, "despite you, not because of you." Jonathan said nothing. What could he say? That he thought about his choice every day? That success in politics seemed empty when you saw your son saving people's lives? Their last meeting had taken place a month before the start of the Senate election campaign. Margaret looked particularly tired. "He's getting married. She's from a good family, a doctor too." Jonathan nodded as he wrote another check. His son's wedding was another event he would never attend. "You know," Margaret suddenly looked at him intently, "Elizabeth was right about you. She said you had the soul of a politician. You always choose what's profitable, not what's right." Jonathan stood up and straightened his jacket. Rain was falling outside the window, typical Seattle weather. Somewhere in the operating room his son was saving someone's life, unaware that his father had come back to town. "The money will be sent as usual," he said, heading for the door. "If you need anything—" "We don't need anything," Margaret interrupted. "Except one thing, stay out of his life. He's happy without you." Jonathan stepped out into the rain without opening his umbrella. Raindrops ran down his face, mixing with something salty. Perhaps it was just sea spray carried in on the wind from the bay. In the car, he took out his phone and opened the folder with the photos taken by the private investigator. Aidan at work, Aidan in a cafe with friends, Aidan with his fiancée. The pictures were taken from a distance and blurry, but they were the only connection he allowed himself to his son. The trip to Seattle always threw him off balance. Returning to Portland, to Cheryl, to the election campaign, he tried to forget the light blue house, Margaret's contemptuous gaze, the photos on the table. But he couldn't forget. In the trunk of his car was a box of clippings from medical journals, articles about Aidan, his achievements, his awards. Jonathan never showed them to anyone, not even Cheryl. They were his secret pride and his eternal punishment. Jonathan's campaign headquarters was bustling with the usual hustle and bustle, phone calls, meetings, an endless stream of people with folders and laptops. Cheryl sat in the corner of the conference room, mechanically making notes in her notebook. After her trip to Seattle, she couldn't look at her husband the same way she used to. Jonathan stood at the board discussing the strategy for the next debate. Lately, he had become more irritable and nervous. Perhaps he sensed that his wife suspected something. Or maybe the pressure of the election campaign had simply reached its peak. "Cheryl, honey," his voice snapped her out of her reverie, "don't forget about the interview for Home and Hearth." They want to do a piece on our family traditions. She nodded, continuing to write in her notebook. Family traditions. How ironic that sounded now that she knew the truth. But then, hadn't their entire life been built on lies? That evening at home, Cheryl was sorting through her wardrobe. Tomorrow was an important charity event, and she had to look flawless. Jonathan walked into the bedroom, loosening his tie as he went. "You've been acting strange lately," he remarked, looking closely at his wife. "Is something wrong?" Cheryl took out a dark blue dress and ran her hand over the silk fabric. "I'm just tired of the campaign. So many events, meetings. I know it's not easy for you, but it won't be long. As soon as I become a senator." "And then what?" She turned sharply toward him. "What else are you willing to sacrifice for your career?" Jonathan frowned. "What are you talking about?" "Nothing. Forget it." That night, she lay awake for a long time, listening to her husband's steady breathing. Fragments of conversation swirled around in her head, details that had previously seemed insignificant. How Jonathan always avoided talking about children. How tense he became when the conversation turned to his past. They hardly spoke at breakfast the next morning. Martha moved silently around the kitchen, pouring coffee. The news was on TV. Jonathan's approval ratings were rising. Voters believed in his image as the perfect family man. Meeting with veterans today. Jonathan glanced at the calendar on his phone. Then lunch with union leaders. In the evening, a charity ball. Cheryl stirred her cold coffee. "I was thinking of visiting my mother this weekend." "Now?" He looked up from his phone. "The election is just around the corner. I need you here." "You need the perfect politician's wife," the words slipped out. "A pretty decoration for your perfect life." Jonathan put his phone down. "What's going on with you? You haven't been yourself for the last few weeks." "Really?" Cheryl smiled crookedly. "Maybe I'm just tired of pretending." The secretary peeked into the kitchen. It was time to go to the meeting with the veterans. Jonathan got up from the table and adjusted his tie. "We'll talk about this later." "Sure." Cheryl turned away toward the window. "We always talk about it later." The day dragged on endlessly. At the charity event, Cheryl stood next to her husband, smiling at the right people and saying the right things. But inside, she was seething with anger and pain. "You're such a beautiful couple," chirped the wife of some businessman. "How do you manage to maintain such a warm relationship with such a busy political life?" "The main thing is honesty," Jonathan replied, putting his arm around his wife's shoulders. "Without it, it's impossible to build a strong family." Cheryl felt nausea rising in her throat. Excusing herself, she went out onto the balcony. The cool evening air brought her back to her senses a little. She heard footsteps behind her. Jonathan. "Are you okay?" "I feel sick," she said without turning around. "Sick of the lies, your hypocrisy, your—" "What lies are you talking about?" Cheryl turned sharply toward him. "You know, I always thought I knew you, that you really believed in the values you talk about, and now what?" She looked into his eyes, brown, warm, just like Aiden's. "Now I don't know who you are." Applause rang out in the hall. Someone was making a toast to the future senator. Jonathan glanced anxiously at his wife. "We have to go. Not here, not now." "Of course." Cheryl fixed her hair and put on her usual smile. "The important thing is to keep up the appearance of a perfect family, right?" They returned to the hall amid a flurry of camera flashes. Jonathan gave another speech about family values, honesty in politics, and a bright future. Cheryl stood beside him, thinking about the boy who had grown up without a father, the woman who had died alone, and the lies that had poisoned their lives. Aiden Frost had come to Portland for a medical conference. His presentation on new methods in cardiac surgery was billed as one of the keynote speeches. Cheryl found out about it by chance while looking through the program at the convention center. The conference hall was filled with people in white coats and business suits. Cheryl sat in the back row, watching Aiden walk confidently toward the podium. In his formal suit, with his impeccable posture, he looked so much like Jonathan when he was young. The presentation was brilliant. Aiden spoke freely, with knowledge and expertise, easily answering even the most difficult questions. After his speech, he was surrounded by colleagues, but Cheryl waited patiently in the lobby. "Dr. Frost!" She caught up with him at the exit. "Remember me? I interviewed you in Seattle." Aiden turned around, recognition flashing in his eyes. "Ah, yes, the article on cardiac surgery. Has it been published yet?" "No. Maybe we could have a coffee? There's something I'd like to discuss." The small coffee shop opposite the convention center was quiet and almost empty. Aiden chose a table in the corner away from the windows. "You're not a journalist, are you?" he said, looking intently at Cheryl. "Who are you really?" Cheryl wrapped her hands around the hot cup. "I'm Jonathan Gibbs's wife." There was a heavy pause. Not a muscle moved on Aiden's face, only his fingers tightened around the cup handle. "I see." His voice was steady, but Cheryl could sense the tension behind his calm exterior. "And why did you come looking for me?" "I found out the truth by accident. I found some old photos, documents. Does he know you're here?" Cheryl shook her head. "No, he still keeps it a secret." Aiden smiled bitterly. "Of course. The truth could ruin his precious career." "Tell me," Cheryl asked quietly. "Tell me about your mother, about how you lived." He was silent for a long time, staring out the window at the people passing by. Then he spoke, quietly, restrainedly, but Cheryl could hear the lingering pain in his voice. "Mom never spoke ill of him. Only, your father had his own path. She worked at a law firm. We lived modestly, but we had enough. Then she got sick, heart problems. Maybe that's why I became a heart surgeon. And the money Jonathan sent? Grandma put it in a special account for my education. I only found out after Mom died. You know what's funny? I could have forgiven him for leaving us, but I can't forgive him for buying us off with money as if we were some kind of annoying mistake that needed to be hidden." Cheryl looked at his hands, beautiful, strong surgeon's hands, the hands of a man who saves lives, not destroys them for the sake of a political career. "Why didn't you try to contact him?" Aiden shrugged. "Why? To hear more excuses, or to watch him panic at the thought that his secret might come out? No, thanks. I have my own life, my own work, my own achievements. I got all of that without his help." "But he followed your career. He was proud of you." "Proud?" Aiden laughed bitterly. "That's an interesting way to show pride, by hiding in the shadows and pretending I don't exist." They sat in the coffee shop for several hours. Aiden talked about his mother, a smart, strong woman who taught him never to give up, about his grandparents who had been like parents to him, about his path to medicine. "You know," he said as they parted, "I've long since come to terms with not having a father, but now, learning that he's built a new life, a new family, it's like an old wound has been reopened." "I'm sorry," Cheryl said quietly. "Don't be." He smiled sadly and a little tiredly. "You're not to blame for his choices, but you know what's ironic? He spent his whole life afraid that the truth would destroy his career, and I've become exactly what he pretended to be, someone who really helps people." Cheryl was sitting in the dark living room when Jonathan returned from another campaign event. On the coffee table were the photos he had found in his office. Young Jonathan and Elizabeth, happy, in love, not yet knowing what lay ahead. "What's that?" He froze in the doorway, not turning on the light. "Your real family," Cheryl said quietly, but in the empty house, every word sounded like a blow. "The one you gave up for your career." Jonathan slowly sank into a chair. His face looked gray and haggard in the dim light. "Where did you find this?" "In your office. You know, I always wondered why you were so reluctant to talk about the past. Now I understand." "Cheryl, I can explain." Really? She picked up one of the photos. Can you explain why you abandoned your pregnant wife? Why you gave up your own son? Why you lied to me all these years? Jonathan ran his hand over his face, a gesture of helplessness she had never seen from him before. It was a long time ago. I was young, ambitious. And now? Now you're different? Or have you just learned to hide your secrets better? A heavy silence hung in the room. Leaves rustled outside the window and a car drove by in the distance. Cheryl looked at her husband, the man she thought she knew better than anyone else in the world. I saw him, she said quietly. Aiden. Jonathan flinched as if he had been struck. What? When? He came to the conference. You know, he's become a wonderful person, a talented doctor who saves lives, and all without you. You talked to him. Jonathan's voice took on a panicked tone. Does he know who you are? Is that what you're worried about? Cheryl smiled bitterly. Not how your son has lived all these years, not what his mother has gone through, but only the risk to your precious career? Jonathan stood up and began pacing the room. You don't understand. Now, with the election just days away, if this comes out, so what? The voters will find out the truth? They'll find out that their candidate for senator, who talks so beautifully about family values, actually abandoned his wife and child for his career. Please, he stopped in front of her. Let's talk about this after the election. There's too much at stake right now. Too much? Cheryl stood up, looking him in the eyes. What was at stake when you left Elizabeth? When you gave up your own son? When you built our life on a lie? I loved you, Jonathan said quietly. All these years. Loved me? She shook her head. No, you loved the image you created for yourself. The perfect family, the perfect wife, the perfect life, all for your political career. He tried to take her hand, but she pulled away. Don't touch me. I don't want to be part of your lies anymore. What are you going to do? His voice betrayed a hint of fear. What would you do? Cheryl gathered the photos from the table. Hide everything again? Buy it off with money again? Pretend again that nothing happened? Cheryl, please, he grabbed her by the shoulders. Think about us, about our life, about my career. Your career? She shook his hands off. You know what Aiden said? That you've been afraid of the truth your whole life, and he's become exactly what you pretend to be, someone who really helps people. Jonathan sank into a chair, wrapping his arms around his head. I can't lose everything now. I can't. What did Elizabeth lose? What did Aiden lose? What did I lose by believing your lies? She headed for the door. She turned at the doorway. Jonathan was sitting in the dark, hunched over, looking so small and pathetic in his expensive suit. You know what the worst part is? She said quietly. It's not that you betrayed them. It's that you betrayed yourself, your honor, your conscience, everything you once believed in. It was an unusually sunny morning for Portland in the fall. Cheryl sat in the kitchen reading the morning news, another glowing article about Senate candidate Jonathan Gibbs. A photo of their happy family took up half the page. The front door slammed as Jonathan returned from his morning run. He stopped in the kitchen doorway, looking at his wife warily. We need to talk, he began. About what? Cheryl didn't look up from the newspaper. About your lies? About the son you abandoned? Or about how important it is to maintain your perfect image? Enough! His voice broke into a shout. Grabbing the newspaper, he crumpled it up and threw it in the trash can. You don't understand. I've spent 20 years building this career, 20 years of an impeccable reputation. Impeccable? Cheryl stood up from the table. You call that impeccable? Get out, he hissed through clenched teeth. Pack your things and go back to your mother. I won't let you ruin everything. There was something unfamiliar in his eyes, fear, rage, despair. Without a word, he left the kitchen. A minute later, there was a crash and the sound of things falling upstairs. Cheryl went up to the bedroom. Jonathan methodically threw her clothes out of the closet, tossing shoes, bags, and scarves onto the floor. "What are you doing?" "What I should have done a long time ago," he said without even turning around. "Protecting my life from your interference." Grabbing a pile of clothes, he headed for the window. Cheryl rushed toward him. "Don't you dare!" But it was too late. Designer dresses, suits, and blouses flew down onto the neatly trimmed lawn. Neighbors across the street were already peeking out of their windows with curiosity. "You're crazy," whispered Cheryl. "You're the one who's crazy," Jonathan yelled, grabbing another pile of clothes. "You think you can just destroy everything I've built?" People began to gather outside. Mrs. Dawson, their closest neighbor, was arguing heatedly with other women, pointing at the bedroom window. "You want a scandal?" Cheryl approached the window. "You'll get one." She threw the window wide open. "Ladies and gentlemen, do you want to know the truth about your candidate for senator?" "Shut up!" Jonathan tried to pull her away from the window, but she wriggled free. Jonathan Gibbs, who talks so beautifully about family values, abandoned his pregnant wife 20 years ago. He has a son that no one knows about. A talented heart surgeon, by the way, a much more decent man than his father. Surprised exclamations could be heard below. Someone was already taking out their phone to film what was happening. "Stop!" Jonathan's face turned white. "You're going to ruin everything." "No, you ruined everything." She turned to the gathered neighbors. "Do you know why he hid the truth? Because his career is more important to him than his family, more important than his own child." Jonathan collapsed into a chair, covering his face with his hands. Cheryl continued talking about the young woman who had raised her son alone, about the boy who had grown up without a father, about the years of lies and pretense. "This is the real face of candidate Gibbs," she concluded, "the man who betrayed his own family for a political career." Camera flashes were already flashing in the crowd below. Someone was calling the news agencies. Mrs. Dawson shook her head, discussing something heatedly with her neighbors. Cheryl moved away from the window. The room was in disarray. Scattered belongings, ransacked drawers, empty hangers. Jonathan sat motionless, looking as if he had aged 10 years. "I asked you," he whispered. "I begged you." "What? To keep quiet? To cover up your lies? No, I've had enough." She began gathering the remaining items into a suitcase. Outside the window, people were gathering, curious neighbors, random passers-by, some already with professional cameras. "Where are you going?" Jonathan asked hoarsely. "To my mother's. Somewhere I don't have to pretend and lie." The doorbell rang. Surely journalists who had sensed a scoop. Jonathan flinched but didn't move. "You know," Cheryl paused in the doorway, "I really loved you. But apparently I didn't love the real you, just the mask you wore all these years." She went downstairs, passing Martha, who was frozen with the phone in her hands. Outside, she was surrounded by neighbors who bombarded her with questions. But she walked silently to her car, where a folder with old photos lay in the trunk, the only real thing left from her marriage. The news of the senator candidate's double life spread through the city like wildfire. By evening, all the local channels were showing amateur videos of the scandal, belongings scattered across the lawn, Cheryl screaming from the window, shocked neighbors. Panic reigned in the campaign headquarters. Staff members rushed between desks, phones ringing off the hook with calls from journalists. The press secretary tried to draft a statement, but one draft after another ended up in the trash. How could she explain 20 years of lies? Jonathan sat in his office with his phone turned off and the curtains drawn. Fresh newspapers lay on his desk with screaming headlines. "The Secret Life of Candidate Gibbs," "The Abandoned Son of a Rising Political Star," "Family Values or Political Ambitions." The door flew open and his mother, Eleanor Gibbs, stood in the doorway. Her gray hair was tousled, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and pain. "Is it true?" Her voice trembled. I have a grandson you've kept from me for 20 years? Jonathan didn't answer. His mother came closer and picked up one of the newspapers from the table. On the front page was a photo of a young heart surgeon who looked so much like her son when he was young. Why? She sank into a chair. Why didn't you tell me? I couldn't. His voice sounded hollow. Back then, at the beginning of my career, it could have ruined everything. Ruined? Eleanor laughed bitterly. And what have you built, son? A life based on lies. There was a commotion in the reception area. The journalists had burst in. Camera flashes, microphones, a barrage of questions. Mr. Gibbs, please comment on the situation. Why did you hide your son? How will this affect your campaign? Security pushed the reporters back, but their voices could still be heard through the door. Eleanor looked at her son as if seeing him for the first time. You know, she said quietly, your father always said that a person's character is revealed not in their victories, but in how they deal with defeat. Now is not the time for lectures, Mom. When is the time, Jonathan? When you betrayed your first wife? Or when you abandoned your own child? Or all those years you lied to me, looking me straight in the eye? The TV was showing interviews with neighbors. Mrs. Dawson, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, talked about poor Cheryl's and how she had revealed the terrible truth. The camera captured the faces of passers-by commenting on the scandal. The ratings are falling, said an assistant who had rushed in. The main sponsors are withdrawing their support. Jonathan nodded silently. The internal phone rang on the table. The head of the election campaign was demanding an urgent meeting. I want to see my grandson, Eleanor said suddenly. I want to meet Aiden. That's impossible, Jonathan shook his head. He hates me. And rightly so, she stood up. But I won't let your mistakes deprive me of my grandson as well. Commotion broke out again in the hallway. Party representatives had arrived. Dry suits, stony faces, folders with documents, crisis managers ready to save what could still be saved. Mr. Gibbs, one of them knocked on the door. We need to discuss strategy. Eleanor headed for the exit. She turned around at the door. You know what's the worst thing? It's not that you're going to lose the election. It's that you've lost yourself. Outside, a crowd was gathering. Journalists, protesters with placards, and curious onlookers. Someone was shouting through a megaphone about the hypocrisy of politicians, while others were demanding the candidate's resignation. A message from Cheryl flashed on his phone. I hope you now understand the price of your lies. Jonathan deleted it without replying. In his desk drawer lay an old photograph of him and Elizabeth, young and happy. It seemed like an eternity had passed since then. Mr. Gibbs, the press secretary peeked into the office. Live broadcast in an hour. We need to prepare a statement. Jonathan nodded, looking out the window at the raging crowd below. Somewhere out there in Seattle, his son was probably watching the news, seeing the career of the father he never knew crumble before his eyes. I wonder what he's feeling. Gloating? Satisfaction? Or just the weary indifference of someone who had long since come to terms with betrayal? Cheryl's mother's small house on the outskirts of Portland was buried in autumn leaves. Everything here remained unchanged. The creaky gate, the old apple tree in the yard, the flowered curtains on the windows. Cheryl sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, watching the sun slowly sink below the horizon. Her mother came out of the house with 2 cups of tea and sat down next to her in a wicker chair. Margaret Andrews had always been a woman of few words, but now her silence was particularly eloquent. The journalist called again, she finally said. They want to interview you. Cheryl shook her head. Over the past few days, she had turned off her phone, stopped reading the news, and closed all her social media accounts. Too much noise, too much dirt. Jonathan's face flashed across the TV in the living room. Another press conference, another attempt to salvage his reputation. He looked exhausted, aged, but still trying to maintain his composure. I admit my mistakes. His voice sounded hollow. When I was young, I made a decision that I regret every day, but I can't change the past. Cheryl turned off the TV. How many times had she heard his speeches, polished to perfection? How many times had she believed every word he said? You know, her mother took a sip of tea. When you married him, I felt that something was wrong. Everything was too smooth, too perfect. There was a letter from Aiden in the mailbox, short and restrained. He thanked her for the truth but asked her not to interfere in his life anymore. I have my own path, he wrote, and there's no place on it for him or his attempts to make amends. But Jonathan tried. Every day letters from him appeared in the mailbox, long, full of remorse and pleas for forgiveness. Cheryl put them in a box without reading them. It was too late for confessions. A neighbor came out of the house across the street and waved. Here, in this old neighborhood, people still remembered Cheryl as a little girl riding her bike through these streets. There was no pretense here, no political games. He came by yesterday, her mother said suddenly. He stood outside the window like a boy. Why? He said he wanted to make things right. He went to Seattle to try to see his son. Cheryl imagined the meeting. If it ever happened, what could a father say to his son after 20 years of silence? How could he explain his betrayal? Another letter appeared in the mailbox, from Eleanor Gibbs. Her mother-in-law wrote that she was also going to Seattle to meet her grandson. Maybe, she wrote, from the fragments of this lie, we can piece together something real. In the evening, Mrs. Dawson, an old neighbor from their neighborhood, called. She said that Jonathan had sold the house and fired his entire campaign team. They say he's given up the campaign, she whispered into the phone. Can you imagine? Cheryl could imagine. A man who had spent 20 years building a career on lies was suddenly left without a mask, without a role, without a script. What would he do now? You need to move on, her mother said, clearing away the empty cups. Start a new life. A new life. As if you could just turn the page, forget 12 years of marriage built on lies. As if you could erase from your memory the man you loved, or thought you loved. Apples fell in the garden, hitting the damp ground with a dull thud. Cheryl watched the sunset and thought about those affected by this story. About Aiden, who grew up without a father. About Elizabeth, who died without ever knowing the truth. About herself, a woman who had lived someone else's life without even realizing it. Somewhere in Seattle, Jonathan was trying to reach out to the son he had never known. And here, in a small house on the outskirts of Portland, his wife was learning to live again, without masks, without pretense, without lies. The conference room at Seattle Medical Center was packed. Journalists, photographers, and television crews filled every inch of space. Aiden Frost stood at the podium, looking out at a sea of faces and cameras. Nearby, a little apart, Jonathan stood frozen, pale, haggard, his eyes dull. I want to make a statement. Aiden's voice was calm and confident. In recent days, my personal life has become the subject of public discussion. My family's history has been turned into a political scandal, but I am a doctor, not a politician. My job is to save lives, not destroy them. Camera flashes lit up his face, which looked so much like Jonathan's when he was younger, but with a different expression, more open, more honest. Yes, Jonathan Gibbs is my biological father. Yes, he was not involved in my life. That was his choice, and he must live with the consequences. But I will not allow this story to destroy any more lives. The journalist leaned forward, hanging on his every word. In the back row sat Eleanor Gibbs, who had seen her grandson for the first time yesterday. Her eyes were filled with tears. My father made a mistake, a terrible, unforgivable mistake. But you know what? That mistake made me who I am. I grew up with wonderful grandparents who taught me the most important things in life, that honesty is more important than success, and that caring for others is more important than personal ambition. Aiden paused and took a sip of water. The room was completely silent. "I can't forgive him, not yet. But I can say this. Enough. Enough turning personal tragedy into a political spectacle. Enough looking for someone to blame. It's time for the truth." He turned to Jonathan. "You wanted to be a senator? You wanted to change the world? Start with yourself. Tell the truth, the whole truth, about your mistakes, your fears, your choices. Maybe then we can start talking." Jonathan stepped toward the podium. His hands were shaking as he took the prepared speech out of his pocket, but Aiden shook his head. "No, no prepared speeches, just the truth." And Jonathan spoke, for the first time in 20 years without a mask, without a role, without political calculation, about the fear of a young, ambitious politician facing the responsibility of fatherhood, about the cowardly decision to hide his inconvenient family, about the years spent in the shadow of his own lies. "I thought I was building a great future," his voice broke, "but in reality, I was destroying the most important things: my family, my honor, my humanity." Aiden listened silently, without interrupting. His face remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes, perhaps a shadow of understanding, perhaps a glimmer of forgiveness. "I'm not asking you to forget or forgive," Jonathan finished. "I'm asking for a chance, not to rebuild my political career, but to redeem myself. A chance to become, if not a father, then at least an honest man." After the press conference, they were alone for the first time, father and son, separated by 20 years of silence. The only sounds in the empty conference room were their footsteps and the muffled voices of journalists outside the door. "You know," said Aiden, looking out the window at Seattle in the evening, "Mom often said that there is nothing stronger than the truth. It breaks down walls and builds bridges." "Your mother was always wiser than me," Jonathan replied quietly. "Yes, and you know what? She would have wanted me to give you this chance, not for your sake, but for the sake of the truth she believed in." They left the hospital under a flurry of camera flashes. Journalists shouted questions and demanded comments, but father and son walked silently to the car, two men beginning a long journey from lies to truth. The next morning, all the newspapers ran headlines about reconciliation. But for Aiden, it wasn't reconciliation. Not yet. It was the first step, the first honest word in a conversation that would last for years. And in a small coffee shop on the other side of town, Eleanor Gibbs had breakfast with her grandson for the first time, recognizing in his gestures, smile, and intonations the traits of the son she thought she had lost many years ago. The psychotherapist's office greeted Jonathan with dim lighting and the smell of coffee. Dr. Sarah Klein, a middle-aged woman with an attentive gaze, sat in a chair with a notepad at the ready. "Tell me why you're here," she suggested. Jonathan stared out the window at the falling leaves. After the scandal and public confession, he had decided to seek therapy for the first time, not for the sake of his political career, but for himself. "I've been afraid of the truth my whole life," he began. "I built a career on lies, thinking I was protecting myself, but in reality, I destroyed everything I touched." Sessions with Dr. Klein became his new routine. Every Tuesday and Friday he came here, learning to understand himself and his actions anew. For the first time in 20 years, he spoke honestly about his fears, his ambitions, his betrayal. Between sessions, Jonathan wrote long letters to Aiden, Cheryl, and his mother, not excuses or pleas for forgiveness, just the truth he had hidden for so long. "I thought politics was the art of compromise," he said during one session. "But where is the line between compromise and betrayal?" Dr. Klein suggested a new approach: use his experience not to build a political career, but to help others. And Jonathan began to speak in schools, universities, community centers. He told his story, talked about the price of lies and the importance of honesty. I'm often asked if I regret that the truth came out, he told law students. I do, but not about the exposure, about the 20 years of cowardice and lies. Gradually, his speeches began to attract attention, of a different kind, not political. People came to listen not to a candidate for senator, but to a man who had found the strength to admit his mistakes and begin to change. Aiden sometimes sent short messages, mostly news about his work, photos from the operating room. Once he invited his father to a conference where he was giving a presentation. Jonathan sat in the back row, listening to his son talk about new treatments for heart disease. You know, he said to Dr. Klein after the conference, I always thought my mission was to change the world through politics, but my son is changing it every day by saving lives. Cheryl was still living with her mother, but they sometimes met up at a cafe in the park on neutral ground. They talked about the past, the present, and the possible future. You've changed, she remarked one day. You've become real. I'm learning, he replied. I'm learning to be honest with myself and others. Eleanor began spending more time in Seattle, getting to know her grandson and rebuilding the connections that had been severed 20 years earlier. She told Jonathan about his habits, his hobbies, his personality, everything he had missed. One morning, Jonathan received a call from the university offering him a position to teach a course on ethics in politics. Not politics as a subject, but as a person who had gone from lying to telling the truth. Are you sure? He asked the dean. My reputation. It is precisely your experience that makes you a valuable teacher, he replied. Students need to know not only about successes, but also about mistakes and the price you have to pay for making the wrong choices. The audience was packed for the first lecture. Jonathan stood at the lectern looking at the young faces, as ambitious as he had once been. Politics is not just about power and influence, he began. It is first and foremost a responsibility to yourself, to your family, to society, and most importantly, it is about honesty, because any lie, even the smallest one, will come back to haunt you and destroy everything you have built. After the lecture, a student approached him, a young woman with intelligent eyes who reminded him of Elizabeth in her youth. How do you know where the line is, she asked, between compromise and betrayal? Jonathan smiled. Ask yourself if you can look the people you love in the eye after telling them about your choice. If not, then it's no longer a compromise, but betrayal. In the evening, he sat in his new apartment, small but cozy, and wrote another letter to Aiden. He told him about the lecture, the students, his thoughts and feelings. He didn't expect a reply. He was just sharing the truth he had hidden for so long. Somewhere in Seattle, his son was preparing for another operation, saving someone's life. And in that, too, there was a truth about different ways of serving people, about different ways of changing the world for the better. The first snow fell unexpectedly early, covering Portland with a white blanket. Cheryl stood at the window of her old apartment, watching the snowflakes slowly swirl in the light of the street lamps. Familiar footsteps sounded behind her. Jonathan had returned from his last lecture at the university. How did it go? She asked without turning around. Fine. We talked about ethics in politics. You know, the students ask surprisingly deep questions. He walked into the kitchen and habitually put the kettle on. After everything that had happened, they started dating, awkwardly at first, with long pauses and unspoken words, but then more and more openly and honestly. Aiden called, Jonathan said, taking milk out of the refrigerator. He's inviting us to Seattle for Christmas. He said his grandmother is already preparing the holiday dinner. Cheryl smiled. Eleanor had truly blossomed since finding a grandson. She moved to Seattle and bought a small house not far from the hospital where Aiden worked. Now they had traditional Sunday dinners, long conversations over tea, and walks around town together. You know, Jonathan said, placing a cup of tea in front of her, Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had made a different choice 20 years ago. Maybe you would have become a senator. Cheryl sipped her hot tea. But you would have been empty inside. They were silent, watching the snow fall. The last few months had changed a lot. In both of them, in their relationship, in the very fabric of their lives. Jonathan had left politics but found a new calling in teaching, working with young people and community service. His story had become an example of the importance of remaining honest with oneself and others. "I've been asked to write a book," he said, "about the path I've taken, about the price of lies and the power of truth." Cheryl turned to him. "And what did you decide?" "I think I'll do it, but only if you help me. You've always understood people better than I do." She nodded. After the scandal, Cheryl returned to journalism, now writing a column on family relationships for a local newspaper. Her articles on honesty, forgiveness, and change resonated with readers. New photos appeared on the living room wall: Aiden in the operating room, a family dinner at Eleanor's house, a walk along the Seattle waterfront. Real moments without posing or pretense. "Remember," Cheryl said, sitting down next to Jonathan on the sofa, "you said that politics is the art of compromise?" "I remember. Now I know that the main art is not to lose yourself in those compromises." The doorbell rang. The mail had arrived. Among the advertising brochures and bills was a letter from Aiden. He wrote about his work, about new operations, about plans to open a clinic for low-income patients. And at the end he added, "Maybe you could help with the organizational part? After all, you have a lot of experience in community work." Jonathan reread that line several times. The first request for help from his son was a small step toward a real relationship. "Will you come with me for Christmas?" he asked Cheryl. "Aiden said he'd be happy to see us both." She took his hand. "I'll go. It's time to start a new tradition, family holidays without masks and pretense." Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the city in a white blanket. Somewhere in Seattle, Aiden was finishing another operation, saving someone's life. Eleanor was getting the house ready for guests. And here, in a small apartment in Portland, two people were learning to trust each other again. "You know," Jonathan said, looking at the falling snow, "I finally understand what it means to be truly successful. It's not power, money, or influence. It's the ability to look into the eyes of those you love and tell them the truth." Cheryl leaned against his shoulder. Ahead of them lay Christmas, a new life, a new relationship, without secrets, without lies, without fear of the truth. And in that was their own special victory, more important than any political triumph.